Grand Theft Auto 3, the birth of modern GTA games as we know them, and a standard setter in the broader genre of open world games. Since its release to critical acclaim in October of 2001, I think it's fair to say that time has not been awfully kind to this game. Of course there's the definitive edition, and I can say that probably made things worse. But few can deny the monumental significance of this title when taking into account the entire history of Rockstar Games and what they're known for today. And those that would are wrong. Because though this wasn't the beginning of one of the biggest series in gaming today, it is the title that unshackled itself from the 2D top-down nature of its predecessors and instead opted for a third-person 3-dimensional open-world experience that allowed for much more attention to detail and of course importantly immersion, transforming the intellectual property into the much more comprehensive take that has only grown in renown ever since with every subsequent release, propelling the franchise forward to eventually release the second best-selling video game of all time, behind a game about punching trees. But despite this distinction, I've never sat down and committed to a full playthrough of GTA III before, and that's something I set out to rectify a good 23 years after its release. I went for the definitive edition because I imagined it would be less hassle. I just don't have a very good track record for getting old games to work, and so these shoddy remasters may yet contribute to our society. I promise I'll try not to hold it against the rest of the game. As for other biases, of which I'm sure there are many, I suppose we'll have to find out together. So join me as we explore Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2024. In GTA 3 we play as Claude, a character who does not speak, and we meet him at the start of the game experiencing a great betrayal. The type of betrayal that gets you shot in the throat, I guess. That would explain why he doesn't speak anyway. However, by some miracle he lives, and though he doesn't speak, I guess that's so the player can self-insert them into the character. Claude is a meat sack that just does what he's told for the most part, and it's not really a game about choice, so I'm not sure how that works. Even Claude's surname is unknown, so it's unclear as to his identity in truth, but this wasn't intended to be a mystery, but rather the path of least resistance. I'd personally like to imagine Claude does have a voice, but he prefers not to use it because it sounds utterly ridiculous. In other words, he's a player insert because that's how I perceive myself. He also looks like he's taken a rolling pin to the face a few too many times, and he also appears to have a 5 head. I can't say there's necessarily a compelling character there because there is no character, and so any traits he has are inferred purely on his interactions with other characters that do speak. He's a calm and serious individual who can keep cool under pressure, especially when somebody's yelling at him, because he knows he'll kill them later anyway. But otherwise he's just a silent man on a mission, and that mission is to get revenge on his ex-missus who shot him for absolutely uncalled for reasons, and he has absolutely no problems transforming Liberty City into a total war zone to achieve that end. And over the course of the game that's kind of exactly what he does. As he makes enemy gangs angry by turning their foot soldiers into mincemeat, he also transforms allied factions into his enemies too. He doesn't move up in the criminal world over the course of the narrative, but rather horizontally. He does jobs for one faction, makes new friends, and inevitably that old faction becomes his foe. Why? Because it makes the districts harder to traverse in gameplay. But it does help convey that Claude's interests are not wholly aligned with those he takes work from. Not that the game necessarily clarifies what Claude's motives actually are, so we're kind of left to deduce that from the abrupt ending. Anyway, I think what I've said so far makes it evident I haven't massively engaged with the story. It's a fast-paced narrative and a silent protagonist isn't necessarily compatible with that, in my opinion. Because as the supporting cast changes several times over, Claude doesn't have the ability to be a constant presence and that makes things hard to follow. But clearly that's a lesson Rockstar learned going into later titles which feature fully voiced protagonists. And if we're being honest, GTA III's focus isn't really its story, is it? You see, GTA III broke ground as a 3D open-world sandbox game, and that's kind of important because it's the type of game where you don't even need to do anything to still enjoy it. Tapping into Rockstar's love for parody, the world is filled with details that allows you to just enjoy observing things going on around you. There's nothing more enjoyable than simply driving around for the sake of it and listening to your favourite radio station, of which there are several to choose from. So whether you're listening to an assortment of tunes from various different genres, or simply a chat show filled with details that help accent the world you're in, there's something there to keep you company and more importantly engaged as you explore the streets of an unfamiliar yet familiar city. I have to say my go-to is MSX FM. I'm partial to a bit of jungle and drum and bass as I drive around in real life, so if anything it felt fitting. In fact, considering I only recently got round to actually playing Grand Theft Auto 3 for the first time properly, I mean, I played it when the Definitive Edition came out, and that went well, yeah, but no. A few weeks ago I saw a poster for a rave of sorts that was occurring not far from me, and on the poster was that PNG of Claude. So I went, and the guy who arranged it told me the inspiration for that being on the poster was because of the radio station in Grand Theft Auto 3, after which the night was themed. So naturally, when it came to inevitably playing through GTA 3 for myself, I was always going to gravitate towards listening to that radio station as I drove around, and honestly it did enhance the experience as I ran over pedestrians. But the point is, the atmosphere of Grand Theft Auto 3's open world is malleable to various different tastes. As you make your way through it, you have some agency over the vibe you want, and that doesn't impact how the various districts of the world are presented to you. There's an understanding that you're going to be driving around Liberty City a lot over the course of this game, and there's no avoiding that becoming a monotonous aspect of the game's design. But rotating the radio stations and listening to all they have to offer keeps things just fresh enough that you don't notice it as much. But there's more to Grand Theft Auto 3's open world than just listening to the radio. There are activities you can engage in as you pass through the world, such as stealing a taxi and picking up fares, stealing a fire engine and putting out fires, or otherwise just sploinking people for the fun of it. You can nick an ambulance and pretend to be qualified as a paramedic, picking up patients and probably doing more harm than good. And of course, you can illegally borrow a police car and engage in vigilanteism, arguably the wrong ism to be immersive. As for making money, observe. There are also stunt jumps because why not? And side missions given to you by mysterious payphones throughout the map. I'm not entirely sure how they can tell it's Claude on the line, but okay. And to be fair, these can be quite painful endeavours, but that more or less sums up how this game generates difficulty in general. There are other bits and bats like importing and exporting cars and off-roading. And then there are hidden packages. We'll never know what they actually are, but they do make weapons spawn at the hideouts. And you do need to do some prep in this game if you want to have weapons in every scenario where you'll need them. On that note, visiting a gun shop can be a bit of an experience.
I don't need any ID. You look trustworthy.
Firstly, why is this guy English? Secondly, I'm quite literally the biggest murderer in town. It's important to know where the gun shops are because if you die in the open world or otherwise get arrested, you will lose all of your weapons, and the game won't necessarily give you some just because you need them. And also, while you're out exploring the open world, it's good to engage in an Easter egg hunt every now and then. You never know what you might find. I've not properly delved into this yet, but I'm sure I will. But to quickly conclude the open world segment, what made it special for its time was it served a higher purpose than to simply be a backdrop for things to occur gameplay-wise. This felt like a living, breathing city, one in which you could explore and get creative in occupying yourself. And though it wouldn't be particularly groundbreaking by today's standards, it was in 2001. And visually, yes, it does look aged, but isn't there a sort of charm to having to work around that with style over realism? And that's why old games still have value today, mechanically, graphically, so on and so forth. Modern games are more powerful and more capable than they've ever been, but there's a charm to having to work with limited resources and limited technology to create these games over having the technology and the resources and having to manage time to make it financially and practically possible to do. So visually, yes, GTA 3 may show its age even in this remastered version from the Definitive Edition, but from a graphical perspective that's endearing. As for the side content you can find in this open world, yes, it is arcade styled and relatively simple when you think about it, but it's clear that immersion was at the forefront when it came to putting these things in the game. And I appreciate the limited abilities of the technology at the time meant you weren't living vicariously through a video game in order to feel engrossed in what's going on, which is what immersion has come to mean a lot more often in much more recent games, even from Rockstar, which isn't necessarily bad. So ultimately, the open world of Liberty City does a lot to sell Grand Theft Auto 3. On the gameplay front, of course, there's a lot of driving involved. The driving in GTA 3 is quite easy, though the cars aren't awfully durable and catch fire at a moment's notice. Naturally, you'd expect a game called Grand Theft Auto to have reliable driving mechanics, and that appears to be universally the case throughout the series. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel as if I noticed cars become a bit twitchy when it's rainy as well, which would be a nice touch if it turns out to be more than a placebo effect on my brain. As for the police chase wanted system, it's star-based, so the more stars you have, the more intense the chase will be. And the more intense the chase, the harder it is to shake the authorities, but there are some simple ways to do it. For instance, there are checkpoints throughout the map that if you drive through, you'll knock a star off your wanted level, and if you want to lose the entire thing, you can head to a pay and spray and get the car repainted, repaired, and a new engine placed in, and somehow the police will just leave you alone after that, which I find especially odd when sometimes they watch you drive into the garage. It costs you some in-game currency, but is incredibly useful. And the arcade-style gameplay has to benefit you sometimes, because it certainly works against you plenty as well. The gunplay is, well, you'll shoot things and they die. It's fine for 2001, likely saw some improvement with the definitive edition. Very nice. You can still carry an excess of weapons that simply don't fit in your pocket, and yet they're there just the same, but the game is intended to be judged by arcade logic, so whatever. And of course there's a variety of weapons there, and there's melee attacks in which you can use your fists or even a baseball bat to do damage to unsuspecting pedestrians and cause some confusion along the way, and that might result in NPCs randomly starting fighting one another. And every now and then you'll be rewarded with money drops for senseless violence, and that in my opinion is the definition of a good life. That'll teach you, paramedic scum. Your money helps you buy weapons and armour, and your health is your health. You lose that and you've had it, haven't you? But armour obviously gives you buffer time before you start taking damage, and if you want to increase your overall max health, you can engage in controversial activities. But where the gameplay truly shows its age is in the mission design. Firstly, the absence of checkpoints pisses me off to no end. In every GTA game, bar 5 and the DLC to 4, if you fail a mission, you have to restart that entire mission, or at least that's the case in every one I've played, which is annoying when in this game it says retry from last checkpoint, but you know for a fact that's the start of the mission. It's a weird one because you simultaneously yearn for the missions to be longer and more substantial, and short because you haven't made progress until you've passed the mission, and after a few goes around and you're not quite getting a certain objective, it can be a bit of a slog to have to redo everything up until that point. And I think Rockstar eventually realised that when it came to Grand Theft Auto 4 and then its DLC, because by that point it was certainly holding back how much substance an individual mission could contain. But back in the 3D trilogy era, as much as I hate this particular feature, I think it does tastefully add to the challenge factor. However, in a game where you can fail for oddly specific things that technically contradicts the ethos of the sandbox open world you're presented with, it understandably does get infuriating that if you fail for any one reason, you're gonna have to restart that mission. There are other arcade aspects to the mission design that feels pitted against you. For example, one big one I noticed is time constraints for absolutely no fucking reason, and that adds an element of urgency where it doesn't necessarily make sense to be present, but of course without it perhaps the objectives would be a bit too easy. There are races where you have to find a car fast enough to compete with, and in my experience things like that only reliably spawn when you're not looking for them. I'm sure there are places where you can reliably find them, but it is still a bit of a faff and isn't necessarily first playthrough friendly. And GTA 3 largely gets away with it and makes it work simply because it's tapping into those arcade elements, so real world logic doesn't apply. There's a challenge and you need to meet it. The only thing I will genuinely attempt to critique rather than just mention as passingly frustrating are the missions in which there are constraints that will fail you for things seemingly unrelated. For example, being confined to a gang-specific car to avoid being identified by people you're going to kill anyway. I get the logic behind the constraint when it presented itself in a particular mission of which there is footage now, but I find the drive-by shooting mechanics to be a tad unreliable, and the car will probably explode after 2 seconds of being shot at. It adds challenge and there is a storytelling reason, but it occurs at the expense of the sandbox. In fact, it went fully out the window in this mission in particular. And when you have to sit down and figure out the reason for why you failed on that point, it is a bit odd. Now, the flip side to that argument is, you could argue Grand Theft Auto 3's mission structure is intended to facilitate trial and error, and that can certainly be a good thing. It requires you to use your brain, and you get a dopamine hit when you actually manage to accomplish something. So with that in mind, a lot of the missions in Grand Theft Auto 3 are frustrating and satisfying in equal measure. A key aspect to arcade style or inspired gameplay is you need to fail a few times in order to get a feel for how to do it right. And it's through that process that you come to truly understand how the mission works and what you need to do to succeed. I can certainly see why Rockstar eventually decided to move on from this approach, as the game's storytelling aspects grew both in significance and complexity. Because when you become engrossed in a story, the gameplay becomes tributary to that rather than the story existing just to facilitate the gameplay like the days of old. and GTA 3 certainly occurred at a time where the latter was more popular. So can the potential obstruction to the flow of narrative truly be faulted when it isn't the priority? And I think that's why Grand Theft Auto 3 comes across as a game that hasn't aged fantastically, especially to somebody like me who played the more recent GTA games first. And that is because I'm expecting the story gameplay prioritization to be in the complete opposite order to how it's framed in 3. It also doesn't help that the faces in this game are genuinely just cursed. I mean, look at this man. I really don't think the definitive edition has helped there, I will be honest. But fundamentally, where it matters, Grand Theft Auto 3 is a product of its time. And I can only imagine it was a bloody good product for 2001 standards. Which I say because I wasn't there in 2001. I was 1, so I was way too busy shitting myself and hadn't quite acquired self-awareness yet. And perhaps I have left it a bit too late to get a proper appreciation for what Grand Theft Auto 3 brought to the table. But what I have come away from it with is, of course, respect. It wasn't the first GTA game, it wasn't even the first open world game, but it certainly pushed towards making games as immersive as possible, and helped shine a light on what sandbox games could accomplish. It's not even an argument of being unique, it's an argument of being uncompromising. GTA 3 contains a lot of features we take for granted these days, but back in 2001, a game that encompassed all of them, even at a more simple level, was no easy feat. It was a huge innovation, especially when contained to the immediate franchise. A franchise that, as time has gone on, has achieved the status of a total giant. And with Grand Theft Auto 6 aiming for a 2025 release, if the reactions to that announcement are anything to go by, that status doesn't just apply to open world games or games, but rather entertainment media in general. GTA 3 is a legendary game, and I can only apologise for it taking me this long to go and experience it for myself. I'm 2 decades too late to holding the perspective people had on it when it was new, but if the current state of the gaming industry is any indication, the new is overrated anyway. Playing all the games in anticipation for a newer title is never not fun, so I look forward to visiting Vice City and San Andreas and doing videos on those games. I've only played them in passing, so I suppose they'll be framed similar to this, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I quite liked making it, it was nice. Thank you all for watching, I really hope that you've enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, maybe subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. And with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care and goodbye.